pleasure to welcome you to today's meeting, which is another in our ongoing series with the Los Alamos National Laboratory in New Mexico. The series is called the Non-Proliferation Forum, which addresses topical issues. Today's meeting is being webcast so that those in New Mexico and elsewhere who are interested in today's topic, which could not be more timely and important, others can remotely participate in today's proceedings. I'm grateful to my colleague Sam Wells, a senior scholar at the Wilson Center and one of our sort of executive vice presidents, who will actually chair the meeting. I'll turn over the podium to him, but I just wanted to say what a pleasure it is to welcome Michael Crapon back to the Wilson Center. He's spoken here any number of times over the years. And I think he just brings extraordinary clarity to whatever issue it is. I think we've had him on space policy and a variety of other topics. But today, Pakistan's nuclear strategy and deterrence stability, again, could not be more timely and pertinent. And it's an issue relative to, we were just discussing, relative to other challenges, such as the Iran nuclear program. For all the discussion there's been on the Iran nuclear challenge, I think there's been far less on sort of the different but quite urgent issues that derive from Pakistan's nuclear program. With that, let me turn the floor over to Sam Wells, who will say whatever he wishes to say to tee up today's topic, and then introduce our speaker, Michael Crapon.
Thanks, Rob. Well, let me add a word of welcome as well. The topic, as Rob indicates, is indeed serious. I would describe the Iranian issue for the United States as a serious problem, and the situation generally in Pakistan, nuclear, Afghanistan, stability of the country, as existentially serious for the world order. So I think this is a much more difficult problem for us, and it has gotten increasingly difficult over the last 18, 24 months, so that where the nuclear part of the puzzle fits into the broader political agenda is something we'll want to try and figure out. Our speaker, Michael Crapon, is a co-founder of the Stimson Center. His expertise is in space security, nuclear arms control, and proliferation, with a particular specialization over many years in South Asia. Before founding the Stimson Center in 1989, he worked at the Carnegie Endowment, the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency of the State Department, and on Capitol Hill. He's the author or editor of 14 books, including Better Safe Than Sorry, The Ironies of Living with the Bomb, a Stanford volume, 2009. He's the author as well of over more than 400 articles. He writes a weekly blog post for armscontrolwonk.com. Michael's visiting in Washington periodically to do his Stimson Center work, but mainly works from outside Charlottesville, so we're pleased that he battled Route 29 and could come up and join us.
I would like to make a plug for Amtrak.
Ah, okay. You.
The title of my talk is on the screen. I want to call your attention to the subhead because this is a speculative assessment. I have been visiting Pakistan for about 20 years. I've been meeting with the folks who do their nuclear deterrent work for as long as the Strategic Plans Division has been stood up. So that's over a decade. And Stimson has been fortunate to host visiting fellows from the Strategic Plans Division as well for quite some time. But this is still a very speculative assessment. There are a lot of things I don't know about this program, and will probably never know about this program. This is where I'm going. This will be the presentation. This slideshow reflects some written work that is not yet done, and your input would be helpful for my final product. So let's talk about the evolution of military control in Pakistan. We tend to assume, given a snapshot today, that the military is in charge and has always been in charge of this program. This isn't true. The military control over the program has occurred in stages over time. At one time, it used to be the military program was in the hands of a civilian elected leader. And when Zulfikar Ali Bhutto met his untimely demise, one of the consequences of that was to shift responsibility from civilian toward military control. But there were other reasons as well. A key figure was Ghulam Ishaq Khan. He was a political figure, a senior bureaucrat, overseer of the nuclear program as well. And he was forced to retire along with the Prime Minister in '93, more control toward the Army leadership. When A.Q. Khan's entrepreneurship was publicly exposed, the military took control of security around the production complexes, more control. And in Pakistan, as in elsewhere, the first generation leadership in the defense sciences tends to have a significant input on decision making. And their successors, while continuing to have significant say, are not quite as influential. And the first generation of lab directors and defense scientists have either died or have retired in Pakistan. I think the military's success in crises with India and the military's reliance on the deterrent to dissuade India from doing things that Pakistani officials didn't want to happen further solidified the military's role in the program. And of course, when you operationalize a nuclear deterrent, as Pakistan has done, then operationalization means military operationalization. So for all of these reasons, over stages, the military has really gotten their arms around this program. And the implications of this, the military is fully in charge. They set doctrine, they set requirements. Because the program is widely perceived within the country as being very successful, I mean, I would challenge you to find some other aspect of programmatic aspect in Pakistan where objectives were set, objectives were realized in a timely manner. What's happened in the nuclear program is unusual in Pakistan, and it is a success as they see it. Pakistan has a Rickover type figure. He's the guy who's the Director General of the Strategic Plans Division. Many of you know his name, Lieutenant General Khalid Kidwai. And he's been in the job since the SPD was stood up. And he stayed in the job even after he retired from the military. There are lots of military officers who, after their retirement, have been given wonderful assignments in Pakistan. There's not one who has been given a responsibility for a joint staff assignment, except one, and that's Kidwai. He's still the head of the Strategic Plans Division at Joint Staff Headquarters, even though he wears a sport jacket or a suit to work in the morning. If there is second guessing about the retirements that are set by very few military officers and 1 retired military officers. It's just not detectable to me. It's certainly not in the public domain. The Pakistani press, which is pretty darn good, the English language press, and which allows vigorous debate on many issues, you're hard-pressed to find debate over nuclear issues in the media. Nuclear issues are a third rail for civilians. If a civilian leader wants to go against a nuclear weapon-related requirement, good luck to you. So the bottom line here is that if Rawalpindi thinks more is better, there are few checks and balances. Now, there are lots of support structure for Pakistan's nuclear deterrent. I'm choosing 4 pillars in particular that I think are they're load-bearing. These are load-bearing pillars. So the nuclear doctrine in Pakistan is India-specific, but not exactly. I'll get to that. Credible minimum deterrence. These are words that we hear often from Rawalpindi and Islamabad. But there's some change going on here, too. Adjust. Nuclear weapons requirements are not a fixity, to use a term that one hears on the subcontinent, especially after the U.S.-India civil nuclear deal and the Indian Army's pursuit of proactive defense or cold start options. First use, that's a key pillar for nuclear deterrence in Pakistan. But I'm going to go into each one of these because there's more than meets the eye. So let's talk about the India-specific nuclear deterrent that we hear a lot about. India is the primary, but not the sole state to be deterred. We hear from time to time about a U.S. threat to Pakistan's nuclear deterrence. We have special forces. We have all kinds of surveillance. We're keeping our eyes on what Pakistan's doing. And as U.S. ties to India improve, and especially after the Osama bin Laden raid, there are concerns, growing concerns, I would say, in Pakistan about a U.S. threat to the deterrent. And as people look ahead to 2014 and beyond, military planners may not be comfortable with U.S.-Pakistani relations down the road. Could still be a lot of friction, depending on how the situation in Afghanistan plays out. Israel has always borne close watching for the guardians of Pakistan's nuclear arsenal. When they get worried about the safety of their deterrent, a lot of times they'll point to an Israeli threat. And, you know, the Sunni-Shia divide in Islam is right across the border in Iran, and Iran's nuclear program isn't standing still. Let's look at credible minimal deterrence, another key aspect of Pakistan's nuclear doctrine. I believe the original requirements for credible minimal deterrence were set pretty high, particularly with respect to plutonium production and reprocessing. And a lot of the structures we see coming online seem to have been authorized around the time when the Strategic Plans Division was stood up after the nuclear tests in '98. But I also believe that requirements expanded further in the midst of a 10-year plan. So about the time that the U.S.-Indian civil nuclear deal was announced, and about the time when Indian military officials started talking about proactive defense. We need options, the Indians would say. other than a full-scale mobilization, which takes 3 weeks after a grievous assault on our soil. So the Indian military came up with some plans that didn't take 3 weeks. and the Pakistanis noticed. So I think requirements were adjusted in around 2005, 6, 7. And I think the reflection of this, Pakistan's position on the Fissile Material Cutoff Treaty became very negative. And we saw the initiation of construction of a 4th plutonium production reactor. And there's no end to what appears to be a growing set of requirements, the most concerning of which is short-range battlefield systems to counter what the Pakistanis call cold start. These quick mobilization options that the Army has, the Indian Army has. So let's look at the adjust as needed piece, or the adjust as needed pillar. I've mentioned there seems to be a new emphasis on tactical or battlefield nuclear use. Pakistan's diplomats are willing to take the heat to compete in nuclear matters with India. They're blocking progress at the Conference on Disarmament and have for several years now on a fissile material cutoff treaty negotiation. The conventional military balance with India is getting worse and worse from Pakistan's perspective. They would like to stay ahead of India, if possible, on the nuclear side. And as neuralgic as Rawalpindi was to the civil nuclear deal, I think they would be equally neuralgic if there was a U.S.-India deal on ballistic missile defense technology transfers. So the pillars of Pakistan's nuclear doctrine, let's look at first use. Numbers 1 through 4. The fellow who heads the Strategic Plans Division gave an interview to 2 Italian researchers, a strange way to convey a message. But in this interview, he laid out these 4 red lines that could trigger first Pakistani use of nuclear weapons. So I'll give you a chance to look at these 4 red lines. One reaction you might have to these red lines is that, they apply more to the 71 war with India than they do today. General Kidwai did fight in that war, and he might have had that war in mind when he laid out these red lines. But I think with the advent of offsetting nuclear capabilities on the subcontinent, a lot of this just doesn't make sense to me. But what does make sense to me in terms of a continuing red line would be Air Force losses, Pakistani Air Force losses in air combat with India. There is a growing disparity in capability there, and if Pakistan Air Force loses big, then there's no air defense of the country. So that's something to think about. And land warfare for limited gains, not for conquering a major part of territory. Limited gains could be extremely worrisome for escalation control, and we always have problems of accidents and the loss of control when there's a crisis and assets are moved. Nuclear targeting, this is really speculative, but it seems to me there is a high, medium, low mix that is being readied. The medium piece is being readied now. The high-low, well, the high has been there for a long time. And let's start with low. Low would be battlefield use with the goal of signaling. You got to stop now. This is really serious. Signaling by means of, there's all kinds of signaling. There's choreography for crises on this in the subcontinent. So you flight test a ballistic missile, you move this or that, we notice, we tell people. All of this choreography is well known. But the signaling by means of a mushroom cloud, that would be new. And with very uncertain results. A couple of the questions that come to mind immediately here relate to escalation control. Whose territory do you signal on? If it's an advancing Indian formation, do you do this on Pakistani soil? Do you do it where logistical massing is taking place behind the forward edge of the battle? But if you use one or just a couple, it seems to me one concern that the Pakistani military might have is that you cede the initiative to the other guy. Now, medium. Medium could be tactical nuclear weapons against integrated battle groups. There are these 9 integrated battle groups that exist, at least on paper, and they could be arrayed across a broad geographic area. The fighting corridors between India and Pakistan. And it's possible that the Pakistani military leadership have come to the conclusion that they need a tactical nuclear option against every one of these integrated battle groups. So that would be a medium option. This is really speculative. The high option is pretty clear, or less speculative. It involves massive nuclear strikes against countervalued targets and perhaps some other targets, with the goal being to deny India victory and to destroy India as a functioning society. So that would help explain why the numbers are growing. Some of you who follow South Asia pretty closely know that a number of senior Indian officials, a former defense minister, a former army chief, lots of hard-nosed strategists have written or said that if there's a war between us that goes nuclear, Pakistan will be utterly destroyed and India will carry on. And my sense is that Rawalpindi doesn't see it that way. So what are the implications for deterrence stability? A friend of mine, a very serious analyst, Ashley Tellis, some of you know him, wrote a big book where he talked about ugly stability on the subcontinent. It could be a little ragged. It won't be neat. But by and large, things will be okay. And there was no real need for significant numbers of these weapons. Well, that appraisal may be a little optimistic. I'm not buying that appraisal. There are new capabilities coming online, especially these cruise missiles of U.S. and Russian parentage, I might add. They're going to sea. Everybody's going to sea. And these short-range systems. So there are new capabilities coming online that don't lend themselves real well to deterrence stability. There's a terrible absence of jointness in both India and Pakistan. The armies don't get along real well with Well, they get along, but they don't work very well alongside air forces and navies. And that raises some questions about escalation control and command and control. I've mentioned that there will be new signaling strategies, perhaps, in crises. And it's going to be harder for the U.S. to play the role of the crisis manager because our relations with India have improved so much, and our relations with Pakistan are now pretty brittle. I throw this slide up for you to consider. What would possibly alter the current trajectory of Pakistan's nuclear programs? Well, we tend to have this monolithic view of Pakistan's senior military leaders. It ain't so. Army chiefs come and go, and the new chief can be very different from the old chief, can think differently. So it's possible there'd be new leadership with a different view of the value of nuclear weapons. It's possible that improved relations with India that have significant domestic backing in Pakistan could have a tampering effect. I wouldn't bet on the first two, not yet. Now, there could be very severe economic difficulties in store for Pakistan. There already are, and they could get worse. Now, that could slow things down. And then there could be a perception-shattering event, an event that my medication is kicking in. I'm not, that's why I'm sweating profusely. It could be, what could a perception-shattering event be? Think about it. It could be a nuclear accident of some kind. Power plants, for example, in Pakistan are very old. There could be a nuclear event in India, a nuclear accident. There could be a military engagement between India and Pakistan that does not end well for the Pakistani military, that could really undermine their position in the country. That is severely dangerous. I'd like you to think about this, because we tend very much to project in straight lines. There could be something out there that throws everybody a curve. So my conclusions are, you can see, the momentum for Pakistan's nuclear programs is going to be hard to reverse. Stockpiles are growing. Capabilities are growing and becoming more diverse. Instability is growing in deterrence equations. The U.S. role as crisis manager is going to become more difficult. The biggest key to deterrence stability so far has been New Delhi's forbearance in previous crises. And that may continue. All of the reasons why New Delhi decided, two very different coalition governments in New Delhi decided not to respond forcefully to significant provocation. All of those reasons are still in play. They haven't changed. And these governments, rode the tiger of outraged public opinion at home after these events for a couple of weeks, and then it went low. Maybe that's still the case. I don't know. The silver lining here, as U.S.-Pakistani ties deteriorate, and as Pakistan's economy deteriorates, there's more reason for Pakistan to open direct trade with India. We see the beginnings of this, how sustainable it is, because I don't know, because when good things happen in Pakistan-India relations, there tend to be explosions to stop this in its tracks, and there'll probably be another explosion, and we'll see whether the economic ties weather this storm and whether leadership in both countries finds it politically, find themselves politically able to just keep pushing down this path. So with that, I'm open to questions, rebuttals, outraged statements.
Michael, let me start by posing a question. It's basically asking you to expand on points made, but you talk about the longtime head of the Strategic Plans Division. What about his troops? Is there a career path, a nuclear specialty in the Pakistani Armed Forces? And if so, how does it relate to the branch that we tend to hear the most about through our media, the ISI?
The SPD is not the ISI. And while there could be collaborative efforts to protect sensitive sites and collaborative efforts for personnel reliability assessments, I think the SPD is pretty much in charge here related to the nuclear side. That's my assessment. I could be wrong. Career path, there are a cadre of military officers, mostly Army, but also Air Force and Navy, at Joint Staff Headquarters that work on nuclear matters. They tend, once they get posted there, a lot of them stay. They get renewals. So there is a, there's in-house expertise, there's corporate memory on issues. It's all pretty good, I think. I only get a look at a very small and selective sample of the military officers assigned there, but the ones that I've seen and have worked with at Stimson, they're outstanding. They're outstanding. They're serious, they're responsible, hardworking, conscientious. It seems to me that there's a clear process in selecting these officers because they tend to have the same personality traits and characteristics, at least the small sample I've seen. What's really interesting to me about the SPD, and this is a fairly recent phenomenon, I'd say within the last 5 years, is they have a whole new cadre of civilian analysts helping and arguing with military officers. And there's a rising generation of researchers, analysts. I'd say most of them are women, by the way. And they have good minds. They're sharp. They're very impressive. And when a corporate military entity, I mean, analogies are so dangerous.
But tempting.
But tempting. Now, when you add a civilian cohort to a military enterprise, something changes. Now, I'm not beginning to suggest that Alan Enthoven and the Whiz Kids have arrived at the SPD, but there are changes afoot, and I think that's pretty good.
Very, very interesting. So let's start this up. Question over here, the gentleman this side, Tanya.
Thank you. Just a question. What do we know?
Please identify yourself, please.
James Turner from NOAA.
Okay.
Quick question. What do we know about the command and control of nuclear weapons and also, materials control, protection, and accountability, for HEU and plutonium?
Pakistan, unlike India, has published its National Command Authority, who sits at the table. They have a development committee and an employment committee. We can only guess what the counterparts are in India. But the stated organizational charts, it's hard to put a lot of credence in them. There are civilians at the very apex. And my understanding is that on nuclear matters, on national security matters, civilians really have to, they're not the deciders. So I think you have to take the NCA charts with a grain of salt. Security, I'm in no position to say. I would note that there's a lot of media attention here to suicide attacks at military bases in Pakistan. And there are also attacks at soft targets outside bases. There have been attacks on ISI stations around the country. So there's a lot of violence, but my takeaway so far is that when 12 guys armed with automatic weapons and rocket-propelled grenades attack a facility, they are repulsed. The local defenders get help from commandos that are stationed nearby, and it's an important event, and sometimes military equipment on the base has been damaged, but so far, security has been up to the challenge.
Tim, in the back. Tonya Bruce, behind you.
Oh, Tim. I thought he said Jim.
You mentioned in one of your first slides that Pakistan has its Rickover. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on that a little bit. The Indian Navy, they're doing sea trials on their indigenously developed Arihant. They've taken delivery of the Russian Akula-class attack submarine they have. And Mansour Ahmed, who you probably know, is speculated that they've set up some sort of sea-based deterrent strategic command organization, although what that really means is very ambiguous. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about this Pakistani Rickover and what he's supposed to be doing.
You're taking me too literally. The Rickover I had in mind is Kidwai. The Rickover, Pakistan's Rickover is Kidwai. So he's a fellow who, he's the boss. He's the key figure. His longevity is extraordinary for military standards. He remains in his position. Rickover, I think, didn't retire until he was 81 or something like that. General Kidwai has retired. I don't know how old he is. I'm guessing mid-60s. So he's retired, unlike Rickover, but he stays in the job. He's like Rickover in that when he believes there's a military requirement, typically it gets met. But he's unlike Rickover in some respects too. Rickover would he would do workarounds. He would You know, if he didn't think somebody in authority had the right mindset, he would go off on his own and go to Capitol Hill and get what he wanted. General Kidwai is not like that. I mean, he goes through channels. General Kidwai has humility. That was not a trait that we associate with Rickover. So there are differences too. I just meant, metaphorically speaking, there's one guy who is very important in this business.
I need any information on the sea-based
Well,
program.
they are going to sea. And, you know, the Indians are going to sea. The Pakistanis are going to go to sea. Now, it's not going to be nearly as elaborate or expensive as the Indian sea-based deterrent, but there'll be something out there.
Gentlemen, please introduce yourself.
Thank you. Thank you. Excuse me. My name is Arnold Zeitlin, and I was the first Associated Press correspondent in Pakistan 40 years ago. I have several things. One, I didn't hear the mention of China. You did, I think, refer briefly to Iran, but you haven't followed up. Two, do you have any idea of how much the United States knows about the nuclear program in Pakistan, such as location and arms? Perhaps Ambassador Milan can help us on that aspect. Three, the conventional strategy in Pakistan in fighting wars against India seems always to have been start a war against India, fight a few days until the international community intercedes and saves us. Does that play a role in the strategic determination in the nuclear arms field? And four, one.
You can't have four questions.
No, this is
Yeah,
a
four
comment. This is a historical comment, so I have to ask you. Bhutto and I had a joking conversation in 1972 about Libya and the Islamic bomb. Was I unwittingly there at the beginning when that happened?
Well, Bhutto named a cricket pitch in Lahore after Gaddafi. That wasn't out of the goodness of his heart. Nobody is going to tell you about the disposition of Pakistan's nuclear forces and what we know about it. I certainly won't. China has played a crucial role. Uranium hexafluoride, heavy water, weapon design, turnkey facilities, various kinds of missiles, solid fueled. I am going to plug a new book that's coming out by Feroze Hassan Khan, the title of which is Eating Grass. And it should be out the beginning of November. I've actually read it in pre-publication form. I think it's a really important book. It's a first-person, very it's a first-person account, because Feroze has worked on this program at the SPD. He was granted access to interview a lot of people. Not everybody, but a lot of people. The book has some of the weaknesses of being an authorized version, but it has a lot of strengths too. And he goes into particulars about the Chinese role. So I should get royalty payments from
I should
Feroze on
add that Brigadier retired Khan began that book at the Wilson Center,
Great.
and we've been in contact with him regularly along the way, and he will make a presentation on the book in this series mid-January. So just watch your emails. Gentleman here.
Rob Cortell with the CEO of Intellex, and we do decision analytics, including things related to counterproliferation. So I have a question about risk mitigation. It's kind of nested. So how much communication is there between the Pakistani leadership and Indian leadership? Is there the equivalent of a hotline? How much communication is there between the military leadership on both sides? And how close are we to the Pakistani leadership in the ability to exert behind the scenes?
There are hotlines. There's a hotline between the political leadership. There's a hotline between the directors general for military operations. There are hotlines between local commanders. Typically, these hotlines are either not used or not relied upon in periods of great crisis. The hotlines don't. I think that one of the most interesting subjects related to hotlines, and maybe this would be a great topic for a Wilson Center fellow, are the cultural aspects that go with hotline communication. And I'll just give you a vignette that I like to give, and some of you may have heard it already. But in my research, I like to try and visit with DGMOs and ask them about their hotlines. And I visited one DGMO on the Pakistani side at a time when the line of control dividing Kashmir was very hot. It's been cool for almost a decade, by the way. But back then it was hot, and so I asked this DGMO, who later became the president of Pakistan, how's it going? And he'd say, well, the Indians are doing this, they're doing that, they're doing this, they're all kinds of firing and mischief and overrunning border posts. And I said, well, did you pick up the phone? And he said, no. I said, why? Why not? He said, it would give him more satisfaction than it would give me. So, you know, the hotlines are good, but honor is involved also.
Hi, good to see you, Michael. Tom Lynch from National Defense University's Institute of National Strategic Studies. You discussed in very helpful detail kind of your thoughts on deterrence stability and the erosion of that given the trajectory we see in Pakistan. Of course, over the last decade, there's been a consistent debate about crisis stability between India and Pakistan, which has a third leg, if you will, beyond the nuclear and the conventional. It has the irregular, the militia provocation piece. And some have opined that Pakistan, whether aiming just to signal India against a cold start massive response, or whether actually desiring to be able to fight such a response, is really moving in a position to try to reopen the option, which has been, as you've mentioned here, somewhat closed off for about a decade, either in Kashmir or in India itself, with the clear exception of Mumbai in 2008, of being provocative in the militia area, with the notion that if it doesn't have this credible short or mid-level response, nuclear-wise, that India's growing conventional capability will, in fact, be a decisive deterrent. And as a consequence, I return to this debate about crisis stability. Do you see the risks of escalating crises, starting with militant attacks and then moving forward, going up at the same time that you see the deterrent stability being eroded, or not?
I do. And I'm having a hard time seeing any other pathway toward the breakdown of deterrence other than through these irregular forces. That's where it starts. I do not see an Indian leadership or a Pakistani leadership doing this of their own accord. The problem, of course, as you know, Tom, there are these linkages. Whether these connections remain live or not, whether these are top-down decisions made through, recently retired military officers. I don't know. I don't know. This is what I do know. That Pakistan loses whenever there's a big explosion in India. Pakistan loses its standing. Pakistan loses its economic wherewithal. Everything gets worse in Pakistan when there's a big explosion in India. And India wins without firing a shot. Now, if India does fire a shot, finally they've had enough, then India could lose too. And at some point, I think, and Ambassador Malam, I really want you to weigh in here, but at some point, it seems to me that it will become so clear that if there's another big explosion, Pakistan loses without India firing a shot. And at some point, that may take hold. And there will be less explosions, more efforts to control and prevent. But I'm worried about another explosion. And I've said this publicly before, and I want to say it again because Indian security is so lax that there are a couple of brand new, wonderful airports in India that are poorly defended. I think that's irresponsible because airports have the profile. They're cosmopolitan, they're part of India's economic momentum, India's public image of a growing, vibrant country. See, these airports have to be better defended. There's a risk in going public with these things, obviously. And I think everybody here is clear that I'm not suggesting where the Lashkar-e-Toiba ought to fire their next shots, but the government of India has to take security more seriously. Bill, do you want to talk about this?
Well, the only thing that I would have added...
Bill, would you get a mic right next to you?
The only thing I'd add, Michael, is that, and it was implicit in what you and Tom were saying, but that these people who caused the explosions in India, the Lashkar-e-Taibas and the many others, mostly have their own agenda with India. And the government has consistently, over the last decade, lost control of these guys. So that the explosions are going to be harder and harder to prevent from the Pakistani side if there were an urge to do so, because these guys are going to just do it anyway when they think. And that's the problem with this growing rapprochement with India, is that they don't want to see it, and they'll do everything they can to deter it.
Hafiz has said that trading with India is trading with the devil.
Yes, I know. Point made.
Yeah.
Gentlemen.
Thank you. I'm John McCormick with the Institute for Multi-Track Diplomacy. Dr. Kreplon, recently you asked your colleagues at Stimson to inventory all the confidence-building measures between Pakistan and India. I read the short article that you referenced those. You kept using the word atmospheric building measures. Well, confidence building measures, maybe it's continuation building measures, I don't know. But where would you put the resolve of the Siachen dispute and perhaps opening the Kargil Road, you certainly wouldn't consider that atmospheric, but would you consider that a game changer?
They're very substantive. They're not as well as atmospheric. So you're right. It's important to differentiate. The point my colleague and I were making in that piece was that atmospheric measures such as the release of captured fishermen, you know, it's like that line in Casablanca. You know, round up the usual suspects, and we'll release them to show goodwill a little bit later. There was no traction associated with these measures. They required so little political capital to do. And so what my colleague and I were calling for were more substantive measures and a process that gains traction. Siachen would be key. It'd be a good measure. Everybody knows pretty much what the outline of an agreement is. It wouldn't surprise me if both Islamabad and New Delhi had the outline of this agreement in their back pockets. But this one would require the Prime Minister to override the army. And
In Pakistan.
in India, in India. So the army has its prerogatives in India. And it's their job to tell the Prime Minister, look, this is what we think we need to do in order to prevent that. And it's not so easy for an Indian Prime Minister to override that. I have long argued that the best approach to the Kashmir dispute was to open the area up for trade, visitation, family visitations, infrastructure development in such a way to make lines on a map seem not so important. So this would fit into that scheme. If you go on our website, www.stimson.org, you'll also see proposals for a Tennessee Valley Authority type infrastructure development across the old princely state of Jammu and Kashmir.
Howard Moreland, private citizen. You mentioned the bin Laden raid, and I was astonished when I learned about it to find out not only was bin Laden still alive, because I thought he's long dead, but the fact that we did it without the cooperation of Pakistan in what we would regard as an act of war if Mexico did it to us. It seems to indicate a shocking lack of ability to talk to Pakistan about important things, and it seems like it's as if we have no real trust about anything, that we had to do this alone. And then the aftermath, I don't know what kind of resentment there is about it. Or maybe the Pakistani army said, hey, we know where he is, but we don't want to have anything to do with arresting him. You do it, and we'll pretend we don't know. I mean, what's the big story about that?
I don't know. Obviously, as you say, there's a lack of trust, but it hasn't. The raid hasn't resulted in a breakdown, a complete breakdown. So, you know, the relationship is going to have these moments. And it's up to leaders in both countries to try and get through the tough times. because we have a lot of interests in common, as well as interests that rub against each other. And we're going to try and manage this relationship. You know, we don't see eye to eye about a political settlement in Afghanistan. That's my guess. There's a lot of friction there. But we do see eye to eye with respect to the social cohesion and economic growth of Pakistan. We want that to happen. The Pakistan military wants it to happen. And if there's a complete break, this is way less likely to happen. So it's a very complicated relationship. That was a tough time. But it's something that the Obama administration, the president, felt we needed to do. And I agreed with him. And it needed to be done successfully, and the probability of it being done successfully was greater, in my judgment, if that information was not shared.
Michael, let me follow up just a moment. Obviously, the partial answer to Howard's question is that the two sides need one another for a good range of things, as you said, and that will continue for a time, but won't it diminish as the U.S. pulls out all the combat troops from Afghanistan, and therein is a problem where we lose some leverage and some mutual interest?
This is so hard to think through. It gives you a headache. On the one hand, when we have less presence a lot less presence in Afghanistan, so we're a lot less reliant on Pakistan for the logistical supply route. We may not be reliant on Pakistan very much at all from 2014 onwards. Now that could work both ways. It's one less common interest, but it could also free up U.S. options of various kinds in Pakistan because we're less dependent. If the Afghan Taliban move across the border, across the Durand line, in southern and eastern Afghanistan, that's where they make their presence, then that's where the drone strikes will be. They won't be on Pakistani soil. If they continue to go after U.S. forces and the central government, or what constitutes the central government in Kabul. I don't know, there's so many ways to think through this. It's hard to make judgments.
The gentleman in the back here. Yes. Just a moment for the mic, please. You'll cut out all of our webcast people if you don't have it.
Alex Leibowitz, also a private citizen.
When did that happen?
2 months ago. You spoke in the beginning about the Pakistanis increasing their requirements for nuclear weapons. Is there a number that they talk about as the sort of total that they're looking towards, or do they keep that sort of hidden and stuff? And then, I don't know if this is related or not, but obviously in the United States and some other countries have lots of sort of think tanks and private groups and what have you talking about all these kind of issues of deterrence and so on. Is there much of that in Pakistan? I mean, obviously it wouldn't be at the same level, but I'm wondering whether that's coming up or how that shapes the debate in Pakistan.
The Pakistani officers that I talk to don't provide a number. They kind of suggest that this will even out and flatten out sometime down the road, but we're not there yet. No number. One of the good things that's happening in Pakistan right now is the growth of think tanks. And I'm heartened by this. There is a cohort of rising talent in this country, and with opportunities for conversations. I think they yearn for connectivity with the outside world. And one of our jobs, in my judgment, as NGOs in this country, is to help provide the oxygen for that. So Stimson and the Carnegie Endowment are working jointly. We are committed to engaging this rising generation. We have workshops in the country. It's a good thing to do.
Well, let's hear from a representative of one of those research centers, Simbal Khan, who is a Pakistan Fellow here at the center this year.
My name is Simbal Khan, Pakistan Fellow here, and I'm heartened by your wrapping up the talk today and by talking about the think tanks. As I come from the Institute of Strategic Studies, and we've hosted you several times there, and interact very closely with Carnegie as well as Stimson Center. I think I agree with your comments on the SPD, the rise of the whole, there's a whole civilian cadre within the Strategic Plans Division, which is kind of taking a larger role in nuclear strategy. I want to commend and ask a couple of questions focused on your 4 scenarios that you painted in the last couple of slides that you brought up. I think the first 2 you mentioned, the first one was about the military leader, a new military leader becoming a change agent in Pakistan's nuclear strategy. And the second one was an expanded kind of support for opening with India, support for changing relations with India. And then you were very dismissive, and you kind of brushed through them and said that you basically don't think both of these are likely, and you jumped to, in my mind, the more unlikely scenarios than the above 2. One comment on that, and I would like to comment on the first, option or first point that you made about the military leader, because I think it's very important as far as nuclear security is concerned to bring that point. And I heard Stephen Cohen at Carnegie the other day, and he also mentioned the same thing, but in a more negative way. You were talking of a new military leader coming in as a change agent and changing Pakistan's nuclear trajectory or stance. He talked about the new military leader coming in and basically running away with the bomb. So I think there needs to be, and I think you and both Stephen, more than anybody, know about the Pakistan military, people who have studied the military over several decades. And we all know about Pakistan military's propensity to play politics in the country. It's a Praetorian army, all that. But everything, something that always comes up with all analysis of the military is that it's an institution. And for me, to kind of craft arguments where we have this vision of this single man coming up and his personality kind of changing the whole institutional makeup and a trajectory of an institution is a bit incorrect. It needs to be put in a better context, because I think going against even by one man trying to change the military's trajectory, he will meet a lot of resistance unless he completely changes the top command in the military. So that has to seep into analysis. Even with Khidwai, I know we talk a lot about, because there's such little known about Pakistan's nuclear program and Khidwai's personality, and he's a face to it, and everybody talks a lot about him. I think he still just heads a very large, very now well-established, very well-oiled institutional machine. His own personality, his own belt will have a small, important but a small impact on the whole thing. So these were a couple of points. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for these cautionary notes.
Good.
Just a couple of things. I think occasionally an Army chief can make a shift. And sometimes that shift can happen through outside of normal channels. So I'm thinking now of General Beg when he was the army chief and his dealings with Iran. But also we've seen, I think, 2 occasions now where an army chief shifted course within his tenure in significant ways and somehow got the corporate leadership of the army to agree. So I'm thinking of Musharraf, who started out with a bang, so to speak, with India, and then in the middle of his tenure, he did a 180.
We could argue about that.
Okay. But I'm willing to entertain the notion that the current army chief, who started out saying, and acting in ways that were not conducive to improved Pakistan-India relations, has lately been saying things that are so far ahead of the political leadership about the internal security threats facing the country. He's way ahead of the politicians. And, I asked my friends who are inclined to do textual analyses to compare General Kayani's recent speech at the Pakistan Military Academy, where he talked about, this is our war. It's not just the Army's war, it's the people of Pakistan's war. Compare that with a speech he gave, same place, right before the Osama bin Laden raid. It's striking to me how different these messages were. And of course, now we're looking at what may or may not be a significant opening via trade with India, which wouldn't happen without military consent. So you're right to challenge me not to be dismissive about the prospects of an army leader coming up, or even the current army leader, of shifting course and managing to get enough of the corps commanders behind him. It's a possibility. But it's striking to me how different army chiefs in Pakistan have been. They're not cut from the same cloth. Maybe this one will follow through with the India opening. Maybe his successor will think even more highly of helping out the country's economy by normalizing economic ties with India.
Rob, you have another question here? Yeah. Just put the mic over.
Rob Cortell with Intellex. So I'm involved in a number of countries in the Middle East and also including now Pakistan and the business community, both with young business entrepreneurs and leadership as well as older. And I recently was in London last week with a USTR Pakistan government-sponsored conference between businessmen. And I'm always struck that there's such a divide between the business guys and the government in these countries. They just trade, and they seem not to care. And when you talk to the young Pakistanis or Indians about Kashmir, they both sort of they act as if they don't care. So, you talk about trade? What can we do to enhance that piece of the equation, or to me, that's how you actually create the relationships and end the isolation and the island of all these places.
Entrepreneurship is in the DNA of the subcontinent. And one of the many reasons why Pakistan has struggled so much economically is because their natural trading routes, both to Central Asia and to the subcontinent, have been closed. if we project that Afghanistan is going to be in a pretty chaotic state for at least the near term, then it's hard to see how Pakistan can grow through Central Asia. But if the line of control and the international border with India remain quiet, and if the relationship can survive another attempt by spoilers to stop it, the trading route to India can become something very important. Can build stakeholders, can help, it would help the military too. But it would help a lot of entrepreneurs who are not in uniform. And it could start providing the connective tissue that we need. Is this the U.S. government's job? Not primarily, only a little bit. One possibility, you know, the Indians have beefed up their infrastructure for trade along the one legalized passage point between India and Pakistan. And to my knowledge, maybe you can help me out here, but I don't think Pakistan has upgraded its facilities across the crossing, across the border.
Pakistan's done it.
Have they done it?
They've done it.
In a big way? Because the Indian,
Almost the same way.
almost the same way? Excellent. Wonderful. I was thinking that that might be an area for Kerry Lugar Berman funds, but if it's already been done,
It's already done.
that's wonderful.
When you're next time in Lahore, I would suggest you to have a visit.
Because when I made that crossing, my last trip to Lahore, it hadn't been done yet, but that would be wonderful, just wonderful.
Oh, there is two. One is like for pedestrians. One is for the trade,
Right,
road trade,
right,
and one is for the railway trade.
right,
So there are three things.
wonderful. I wasn't aware of that.
On that positive note, maybe we should draw to a conclusion. All of your questions have been excellent. The answers were equally good, and please join me in thanking Michael for a very